Hello, everybody. Welcome to this week's lecture in the lecture series Global Narratives of Disinformation. My name is Gleb Albert. I'm assistant professor at the University of Lucerne, and I'm very happy to present this week Roman Horbyk. Before I say a few more words about our speaker, just a short notice для тех слушателей, которые хотели бы услышать эту лекцию на русском языке, у нас есть перевод. Можете просто нажать в Zoom на кнопочку с глобусом, и тогда вы услышите просто всю лекцию и дискуссию на русском языке. So back to English. Roman Horbyk is research lecturer at the Department of Slavic Studies at the University of Zurich since this year, actually. Before that, he worked as postdoctoral researcher at Södertörn University and Umeå University, both in Sweden. And he actually defended not one, but two dissertations, which is quite unusual. One on the illustrated press in 1920s Weimar Germany and Soviet Ukraine at the Kyiv National Taras Shevchenko University at 2015. And the other dissertation on media power and on media power in representations of Europe in Ukraine, Russia, and Poland during Euromaidan. This one was defended at Södertörn University at 2017. So Roman Horbyk is on the one hand a media scholar, on the other hand a historian. Yeah, one could say that. Before that, among other positions, he held a URIS fellowship at the University of Basel. And like among the many activities that his biography lists, maybe what's relevant in this context is that Roman led a 3-year project called Mediatization of Propaganda from Papers to Bots, which was focused on differences and similarities between Soviet Cold War propaganda and current Russian propaganda. And there is an edited volume in preparation, right? Called The Swarm Doctrine, How to Wage an Information War. So, without further ado, I would like to hand over to our speaker. And for the next 45 to 50 something minutes, and afterwards, you will be able to ask questions and to discuss with our speaker through the Q&A function in Zoom. So, Roman, the floor is yours.
Good evening, everyone, and thank you, Gleb, first of all, for a brief but a very factual and to-the-point introduction of my academic career. And I would like also to thank the University of Zurich and Professor Zasse and everyone who is behind this wonderful initiative, this Ringvorlesung lecture cycle on Russian disinformation in the global context. And it is a great honor and a great pleasure for me to be part of it and to talk about a subject that is both extremely interesting, much understudied, and highly relevant today for all the reasons that you will understand. So without further ado, I will continue to my lecture and I will share the slides with you. So it will take a little time since my laptop has been a bit sluggish of late, but I hope that in a really short while you will be able to see the presentation. Yes, right. So now you can see the title slide. So if there are any problems, any technical problems with the presentation or the slides or anything, so please let me know so that I can do something about it, right? So I'm going to talk about Soviet and contemporary Russian information operations in a comparative perspective. So I'm going to talk about the continuities and discontinuities. And it is quite obvious, of course, that right now we're living in a world that is really preoccupied with all sorts of undue information influence. and also a world where everybody is trying to influence others in some way, and a lot of this influence is done in the form of activities that are not seen as bona fide, so to say. We can not only think about Russia, because of course here in Europe, from our European perspective, Russia is of course the actor that is mentioned most often in this context. But we can also think about, for example, China. We can think, for example, about this article in the Wall Street Journal I saw just a few years ago about Western intelligence services really being extremely surprised and astonished at the extent of the Chinese influence in Western societies, which I think tells a lot and speaks for itself. The fact that these services are surprised at that fact. And then we can also think about the recent kind of, let's say, incident or the recent tension in the Canadian-Indian relations, right? And Canada also accusing India of this kind of nefarious activity on the Canadian territory. So it is a global problem. It is not just about Russia. But we will focus on specifically the Russian and more closely the Soviet and the possibly neo-Soviet approach to information influence and propaganda. That also in many ways foregrounds the Chinese tradition as it has been practiced since Mao, at least, and also basically added quite a lot to other traditions of information influence. So I am departing from one specific question that I have been also preoccupied with as a researcher for the last few years, among other things, of course, which is to what extent we can speak of the Russian propaganda as a continuation of the Soviet propaganda. And this is a question that seems perhaps a little self-evident, superficially on the surface. But when we think about it, and especially when we start looking at empirical research done about it, we will get quite confused, because we will see, for example, that according to some researchers, there is a very strong continuity with the Soviet mass communication, at least in terms of the themes, and that it is basically a continuation. On the other hand, others are a little bit confused, as it seems, themselves, and finding things that are both similar and strikingly different. Others propose that actually the current Russian information strategy is sort of unprecedented, particularly because of the novel media landscape in which it is acting, right? Because of the digitalization and particularly mediatization, perhaps, right? So what is going on, basically, right? How can we make sense of it? Is there a continuity? Well, apparently there is, but just how much continuity, and what exactly is a continuation of the Soviet approach, and what exactly is new, right? So this is the question I would like to tangle with in this lecture today. And of course, some conceptual quagmire is in order right now, because we might think about information influence in different ways. I am often using this phrase, information influence, because it has gained traction in research. It is a little neutral, perhaps, and in that way, it is unlike propaganda. Because propaganda has a long history, conceptual history, that is not always nice, to say the least, to put it mildly. On the contrary, it is quite negative, and basically it has become sort of a label that is very often used to accuse your opponents or anything you don't like. But basically, I would argue that propaganda is still a useful concept, and particularly because it is used by practitioners. So it is the concept that kind of originates from the environment, from the professional circles that are working with it, and that makes it still relevant. On the other hand, I would argue that propaganda, specifically due to this negative kind of a flair that is following it, is a useful way to talk about particularly more nefarious and illegitimate attempts at what otherwise would be called public diplomacy or strategic communication. Propaganda has, of course, suffered a bit of a crisis, particularly after the end of the Cold War. I'm sorry, since it was seen as less relevant, perhaps, and that is once again quite a serious testimony to the deficiencies of our own academic field, I think. But this is a topic for another lecture, and this is something that scholars who deal with this problem admit themselves, as you can see. Now, how we can define propaganda is, of course, a difficult question. And I very recently I did an entire presentation, an entire talk about it at a pre-conference just before the ECREA conference in Ljubljana. So I will not be doing or repeating this here because I have a different focus, but it is worth mentioning that there are, of course, very numerous definitions of propaganda. I think for the reasons of practical simplicity, we can operate provisionally with this quite popular but still rather imperfect definition provided by Jowett and O'Donnell, basically the classical book, or almost like the handbook, the standard handbook for propaganda studies, as the deliberate systematic attempt to shape perceptions, manipulate cognitions, and direct behavior to achieve a response that furthers the desired intent of the propagandist. And I would like to immediately emphasize the weaknesses here, such as the deliberate character, the intent, which are often available to us, accessible to us as researchers only in retrospect, right? They're very, very difficult to establish. So this is something that really makes this definition problematic for me. And there are also other problems, but provisionally we can accept it as a sort of a working definition. Now, we also need to choose some kind of framework that would help us make sense of the changed media landscape if we want to compare Soviet propaganda and Russian propaganda today. Because, of course, if we look at what the Soviets were doing in the 1960s, in the 70s, even in the 1980s, of course, that was a very different media ecology. That was the era of mass communication. That was the era of broadcasting. Now, living in the age of social media. So, of course, it is only natural that we need to also take into account the transformations that have happened. So for this, I choose mediatization as the theoretical framework for understanding the influence of media and the change of the media landscape. And mediatization can be defined, on the one hand, as the increasing adoption of media logic by other social fields, as it is often done in the institutional approach to mediatization theory. And on the other hand, from the so-called cultural approach to mediatization as a concept, it is often seen as the transformation of practices due to adoption of new media, as it is done in the work by Nick Poldry and Andreas Hepp that I very much admire and also basically follow mainly in my own work. So it basically means that we start doing things differently when we start doing them with new media, right? We change the way we do things. We change our practices. So when we study mediatization of something, we study how exactly we start doing things differently when we start doing them with new media. So this is what I mean when I talk about the mediatization of propaganda. how the practitioners of propaganda do propaganda differently when they adopt new media, right? But perhaps apply some of the old models.
Sorry, Roman, may I
Yes.
interrupt you for 1 second? There are listeners asking whether this change of slides is broken, or is it still simply your first slide? Just to clarify this.
No, I think I have changed already several slides. So I don't know. Okay, it seemed to be working while we were testing. I can start again.
Please do so that we
Because I
fix this
have.
early on.
Yes, thank you so much for bringing this up. I guess, yeah, maybe I kind of shared it twice, in fact, because it was slow. Okay, what slide can you see now?
What is propaganda is the slide I
Okay,
can see.
so this is a different slide, right?
Mhm.
Okay, this
Can you
is,
perhaps go one more further so that we see that the change actually?
yes,
Ah, yeah, it
yes,
works. Okay,
it
great.
works. Now,
Thank
okay,
you. Thanks a
can
lot.
you
Now
see
we
the
can
next
simply
slide?
continue.
Can you see the next
Yes,
slide?
yes, yes.
Okay. So
Thank you.
now that we have clarified, even without maybe some slides or missing some slides, the conceptual quagmire, I would say, around propaganda and information influence. Of course, we need to admit that information influence and even more broadly political warfare, which also includes suppression of dissent and policing, surveillance of the behavior of the citizens or the subjects, have a much longer tradition in what is now Russia, right? It dates back, basically, according to some scholars working on this problem, back into the Tsarist times. So back into the times of the Russian Empire and the Grand Duchy of Muscovy, even before that. We can, for example, think about the so-called Akhrana, or what is known in English as the Guard Department, set up in 1881 to disrupt opposition to the Tsar. It was busy monitoring emigres abroad. It maintained a department in Paris and other European capitals, and it probably was among the first political police units that pioneered the use of fake organizations, front organizations. They would basically create these like fake radical groups, that would attract supporters of radical ideas, revolutionaries, who would later be rounded up and cracked down upon as members in these front organizations or fake organizations. Akhrana is also notorious for most likely having created the one of the fundamental texts of Western anti-Semitism, the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. So it has a really, really complicated and nasty history in many ways. We can also think about some earlier eyewitnesses, such as the French aristocrat Marquis de Custine, who went to Russia completely enamored with the country. He was a French conservative who wanted to restore the monarchy in France, and he looked up to the Russian monarchy as an example of how absolutism could still work in the 19th century. He became deeply disillusioned with Russia after spending some years there. And in his memoir, which is quite well known about Russia specialists, he basically called the life in Russia a permanent conspiracy against the truth. Quite a telling observation. We can also think about the secret prikaz or some kind of secret police that was founded in Moscow way back in 1654. And now, of course, you would ask probably why 1654? Why this year? Well, I could only speculate, but I have a hypothesis that is worth checking because 1654 was the year when Muscovy kind of subsumed the Ukraine, or basically entered into an alliance with the Ukrainian Cossack Hetmanate, rebellious against Poland, which meant, among other things, that Moscow was flooded with lots of foreigners, such as Ukrainians and maybe some Belarusians and maybe more Lithuanians and even Poles than before. We definitely required some more policing. So this might be one of the explanations for this. And then we have also this fascinating account from a Paul of Aleppo, an Orthodox figure, a bureaucrat, an aide to the patriarch, who traveled to Ukraine, to Moscow at this time, and left really, really interesting memoir, for example, about how easily anyone could be dispatched to Siberia just for looking too attentively at the cannons in Moscow, which definitely struck him as something unusual, as more policing, more surveillance, and perhaps a stricter punishment than he ever observed, right? So here we can see the man of the Akhrana, the guard department, and also some of the imagined pictures of the political suppression of dissent in the 17th century Russia, painted by the 19th century Russian artists, which are, of course, imaginary reconstructions, but yeah, they still might help us also, not the least, understand how Russians themselves thought about it in the 19th century. Now, we can also think about such interesting cases as this fantastic piece of fiction by Joseph Conrad, Pole from Ukraine, who became a classic of English literature. And his quite well-known novel, The Secret Agent, published in 1907, where he showed a really profound understanding of how the secret police and political warfare worked at that time. And he has this fantastic monologue by a functionary at the supposedly Russian embassy in London, who is trying to coerce one of his local collaborators into a terror attack. And he basically explodes in this vitriolic retort against the democracy. And he basically wants to stage something that looks very much similar to the reflexive control that we will see later in the Soviet model. So he's trying to control the foreign public by feeding to them an argument they would accept as valid, and he proposes bombing the Greenwich Observatory, right? And he basically thinks that madness of this act, the absurdity of this act would be very, very effective, more effective than anything, right? He says madness alone is truly terrifying in as much as you cannot placate it either by threats, persuasion, or bribes, right? So this is, and he wonders by the end if he could throw a bomb into pure mathematics. I think talking about the current attack and assault on science and expertise and knowledge from the agents of conspiracy theories, and also thinking about the madness, the sheer madness and brutality of the Russian invasion into Ukraine, I think it tells us a lot about how this was already seen and perhaps practiced more than a century ago. But of course, the true beginning of the Soviet propaganda model should be dated to this man, Vladimir Lenin, obviously, who merged this Tsarist tradition of political police with a more gang-like terrorist criminal structure and approach of the Bolshevist faction and the Marxist-Leninist theory. The core tenets were laid by him in his classical work, What is to be Done, where he says that basically all communication is propaganda. So all press is dependent on someone. It is dependent on owners. So that means that you cannot have free press. You cannot have freedom of speech. It is impossible. So it is basically a bourgeois capitalist bullshit. And as a result, you can only have propaganda, basically. And this is good. So he was very positive about it. Let's have more propaganda, just not bourgeois propaganda, but rather instead proletarian propaganda. And propaganda for him also meant political organization. A way like founding a propagandist newspaper would be the best way to found a political party. He also, just like Plekhanov, kind of precursor figure in this Russian tradition, socialist or Bolshevist tradition, he drew distinction between agitation as an immediate and very subversive, disruptive call to action, and propaganda as a more long-term, more kind of indoctrinatory or even educationary in a way approach to controlling the moods and the minds of the masses. And some of the further cornerstones of this early Bolshevik propaganda were the flexibility of the concept of truth, which was famously picked up by George Orwell in 1984 when he writes, these alliances, these totalitarian countries he describes in his novel continuously change alliances, but then they also retrofit the past to fit the current situation. And they say, like, they change allies, and Oceania drops their alliance with Eurasia and joins East Asia. But for everyone, Oceania has always been at war with East Asia, right? This is something that was pioneered by the Bolsheviks. The party had the monopoly over the truth, and if the party changed what the truth was, then everybody had to basically accept it. Then censorship and total control over print were really important. Print and propaganda materials were designated as military-graded goods, which gave the trains carrying them the top priority on railways alongside ammunition. That alone shows how important they thought they were, what kind of priority they had for the Bolsheviks. Then illiteracy at the time was also an important factor in making posters and cartoons, but also the oral word, popular tool. It was also a period of more artistic experiments, especially in the early 1920s, and also some multimedia experiments, as we would say today, with wireless transmitters, own print and movie projectors carried by aged trains or aged ships traveling from town to town and from village to village. They understood the importance of film for propaganda, but since they could not really produce a lot of new film, they basically showed old bourgeois movies to attract the audience to other propagandist content, such as speeches and posters. And radio was seen as especially a useful tool for reaching foreign audiences, as a newspaper without paper and without boundaries. And here you can see some of the classical examples, the more classical ones, the more traditional ones, and the more artistic ones. And then, of course, the fantastic examples of the flexibility of truth for the Bolsheviks, which is evident from how the photographs of Stalin were doctored to remove his allies whom he had executed. Now, later Soviet propaganda evolves into new direction. So there is a marked shift in the Soviet propaganda as practiced by the Soviet institutions after Stalin's death in 1953. And especially after a brief transition period, a new era is ushered in by the Department A of the first Chief Directorate of the KGB, which was founded in 1959, and which developed a lot of tactics that were already well known, such as the use of front organizations, such as even the World Peace Council and other institutions that seemed legit, that seemed independent, that seemed neutral, but in fact were controlled or influenced by the Soviets and used to spread their propaganda materials or influence particular individuals with decision-making powers. As Harold Laswell, a classical scholar of the 20th century propaganda, who also studied the Soviet propaganda, said there was a unity of strategic aim in this Soviet propaganda to maximize the power at home and abroad of the ruling individuals and groups of Russia. So he already observe this kind of non-ideological element, which becomes especially important after the collapse of the Soviet Union. At this time, especially in the 1960s, the key themes, as found by contemporary scholars who studied Soviet propaganda back then, are, for example, creating the image of the adversary, basically the bourgeois countries, especially the US, through creating this picture of a polarized and dichotomous world. And then this war and peace theme that weaponized the fear of war, and that we can still observe in Russian foreign policy. It's basically like making as many militant threats as possible, and after each of them, like taking a step back and saying, yeah, but we're all for peace, so let's have talks, right? As a way to coerce the opponents, the rivals, to unfavorable negotiations, for example. And also quite cynical uses of non-Marxist, non-socialist ideologies, such as nationalism, particularly in appealing to post-colonial nations. Also uses of what today would be called public diplomacy, such as cultural, academic, and student exchanges. And especially advertising the Soviet expertise in modernization, and particularly to the third world country, right, which you even can see in this poster featuring cosmonauts, as like these larger than life Titanic figures floating over the humanity. And there is a fantastic book which I recommend to everyone who is interested in Soviet propaganda by Frederick Barkhorn, published in 1964. He was an interesting figure. He went to the Soviet Union, in fact, as part of those academic exchanges, and he got arrested there. So President Kennedy had to intervene personally to basically get him released shortly before Kennedy himself was murdered. So Barkhorn produced one of the most interesting volumes on the Soviet propaganda. Here, particularly the definitions of propaganda in the West and in the Soviet Union. And he found that while in the West, propaganda was seen negatively as based on manipulation and deception, the Soviet understanding saw it as right and desirable, the proper way to conduct political communication, which is completely unsurprising if we think back to what Lenin wrote. And that was definitely the cornerstone of the Soviet thinking about communication in principle. And he also observed that alongside the messianistic promotion of Marxist-Leninist ideology, they also use increasingly what he called the expediential manipulative element, whereby the appeal is addressed to the broad audience, not necessarily supporting its ideology, which is connected to its own interest by means of semantic adaptiveness, which basically means, if we are talking, if we, the Soviets, right, if we want to swing, for example, an Islamist faction in a particular country, in an Arab country, to our side, will appeal to Islamic values, even though that goes against the tenets of Marxism-Leninism. So this kind of cynical manipulative element, that we can basically adopt, and we can produce whatever message that will get the job done, regardless of our own ideology. Now, all these practices, and particularly the work of the Department A, led to the development of the model of reflexive control, which could be seen as a framework for understanding Russian information influence. According to many researchers, I would particularly recommend the article by Thomas and the chapter by Biola. And what is reflexive control? Well, it is a model where you first map the target's cognition and perception, what one does, how one thinks, which arguments have power for the particular target, a group or an individual, or the whole society perhaps, or which arguments are valid at all, what are the target's emotions, which values are important, and so on. And these then can be used to manipulate the target with correct arguments and information, which is not necessarily disinformation or misinformation. It could also be truthful, but just the correct information that just this target needs to be pushed towards the decision that the propagandist needs, and in this way to control it. And this leads to this twofold understanding of how we can work with information as propagandists. On the one hand, information can be managed passively, which means collection of information, both espionage and open sources, and then actively. It can be actively applied, right? Application, feeding in information to lead the target to the necessary decision. And hence comes the concept of active measures. So there are passive measures, just gathering information, and active measures, applying information to influence. And active measures are a well-known concept in the studies of Russian propaganda and political warfare, which is also elsewhere defined as including activities such as disinformation, propaganda, forgery, and in some cases assassination, right? So it's not just about communication. There are also some non-communicative elements, some kinetic elements, as we would say in war studies, for example. So this is quite a complicated scheme of how reflexive control is supposed to work as a model. So first, you build this model of enemy, the logical aspect, the thinking, right, the psychological aspect, emotions, and so on, social cultural aspect, right, values and things like that. And then you either influence the enemy through basically shaping its goal or conveying an image of who we are and what we want to do. So, for example, by using that madness trope, right, that Conrad was writing about in the early 20th century, like we're completely insane and we're ready to bomb you to smithereens and we're ready to turn the entire world into nuclear dust. Yes, and we have the capacities to do that. We have the capabilities, right? And this might be our goal, in fact, if you make us real angry. Right? So this is all used to manipulate the target through this a very popular device of the nuclear scare that we still see being used very, very much. Or you can also apply destructive control, such as paralyzing the goal, the target, or causing spontaneous behavior, right? But we'll not go into extreme details here. So but my purpose is to give you the overall idea about how it is supposed to work. So these models are outlined in the KGB manuals. Some of them, just basically a handful of them. There are many more you can see on screen. As you see, they were written in different times, starting from the early 60s, and then until the very end of the Soviet Union. Some of the interesting authors that I was able to identify are, for example, General Major Viktor Vladimirov, who was a long-time Soviet spy in Finland, and finally the coordinator of the entire Soviet network in the country. And each time he did it under the legend of a Soviet embassy employee. So he was one of the authors of these handbooks or manuals. They are, in fact, quite short. Like some of them are quite long. For example, this late 1989 book on the political intelligence from the USSR territory is about like 300 pages, I think. It's a proper handbook. Some of them are really short manuals, really, like maybe 50 pages or 60 pages long. They were all published in limited circulation, maybe 50 to 100 copies by the KGB for internal use and classified as secret. So what we can see from these models, from these handbooks, what kind of model of propaganda can we build? So first of all, there is indeed a lot of Marxist-Leninism, but there is also this realist perspective on international politics as a zero-sum game. So the enemy is becoming weaker, and as a result, we are becoming stronger, or vice versa. So there can be no win-win. It's either or, either them or us. Then passive measures are discussed quite at length, and they rely a lot on personality polls, on media monitoring, and also attending events and conferences, including academic events. And then Soviet and foreign researchers and academics are particularly identified as a resource for intelligence, active measures, and propaganda. Teachers with Soviet roots at Western universities such as Harvard or Columbia were approached and groomed as gatekeepers to alumni appointed to governmental and security jobs. And there was also active recruitment among both pro-Soviet and anti-Soviet circles, right? So they tried to have their agents everywhere. And then everybody who was coming to the Soviet Union, even as a tourist, could become a target for recruitment or other type of influence. Also, the use of culture is very interesting, as well as the use of front organizations, these fake organizations, which they call podstava. That's something like a trap or basically a front organization. For example, they speak about establishing fake agencies or fake publishers and fake newspapers and things like that. They also divide the active measures, how information is applied, into open channel and closed channel. Open channel is the official propaganda, wide propaganda through legitimate organizations, statements of the government or the spokespersons or the statements of the official media, state media. Whereas the closed channel is basically what was called at that time in the 20th century black propaganda. So using a lot of disinformation, manipulation, psyops, and basically carried out through illegal activity. Then they also have this interesting concept of directed information, which they saw as possibly true or maybe incomplete or distorted information that was delivered to a specific person, institution, or group with a specific purpose, with an expectation that it will prompt a desirable action. So basically, as a method of reflexive control. And disinformation was seen as in opposition to this, as like outright invented information, right? So directed information should have been at least partially truthful. They described how to do what we call source laundering, basically creating a chain of references and republications that would obfuscate the origin of the information or disinformation, and also describe a really interesting technique which may be called the planted inference. So instead of just hammering the message directly, they would stage entire spectacles using agents that acted as seemingly unconnected individuals, unrelated to each other, that, for example, could hold a conversation or some kind of altercation and maybe even a fight in front of the target to create an impression that it was completely spontaneous and to kind of plant an idea as an own observation, because that was seen as a much stronger kind of persuasion than if you really actively try to persuade something, to talk someone into something. They were also very conscious of the medium. So, for example, they discussed press conferences as being especially authentic, especially in the capitalist countries, because it is seen as kind of a more authentic way to deliver information through a human voice, a particular individual voice, and also they are seen as an element of democracy. An example of how late Soviet propaganda functioned is this so-called Operation Infection or Infection, because it was first it became known through the East German sources, when they published an article in an Indian newspaper that had earlier been established as a front organization by the KGB operatives, where they basically published this completely made-up information that HIV was created in an American biological weapons lab. This was disproved multiple times, but nevertheless, this disinformation was laundered by using multiple sources. They cited this in a Soviet newspaper, and then it was reported with reference to the Soviet newspaper by East German scholars at a conference in Zimbabwe. And as a result, this conspiracy theory gained much traction in the developing world, to the point that even President Obama had to publicly denounce it already in the 2010. Now, looking at what has changed, we may talk about this new Russian propaganda, which is characterized by the changes in the media landscape. First of all, the broad use of big data, collected and traded by tech companies, also in Russia. We can think about Yandex and others. but also Western social media platforms. Also the use of hacks and leaks, such as WikiLeaks or Panama Papers as political propaganda. And also some unconventional practices by other actors. So, for example, scholars who study the Islamic State or Daesh propaganda propose this concept of full spectrum propaganda that is comprehensive in the range of outputs it produces, cohesive in the way it articulates these formats together in a coherent whole, and multidimensional in the level of objectives it pursues and the audiences it targets. So we can also talk about this new Russian propaganda as a full spectrum propaganda. Researchers discuss whether there are more or less money invested in this than in the Soviet times in the present day Russia. So there is a speculation that there is potentially maybe more money invested. Then also a key difference is this what Marcel van Herpen calls seizing in a parasitic way the Western liberal value and critical doubt in a postmodernist denial of everything, or trying to hack the Western opinion-making system by exploiting its reliance on some basic consensus about some at least most basic facts, right? But this can be easily subverted, and this is what they're trying to do. Of course, they also try to use all sorts of like novel research and ideas, not always empirically tested, such as neuromarketing or neuromanagement, and of course the use of the digital, right? So this is really what makes it different from the Soviet propaganda, obviously. But one of the differences is the fact that propaganda is often outsourced to private enterprises, such as this notorious holding, a media holding Patriot, which belonged to Yevgeny Prigozhin, the Russian warlord and Putin's chef, allegedly, who was of course killed after his botched coup attempt. And other people such as Vladislav Surkov, who was there before Prigozhin and who took over after Prigozhin now, and also his preacher, his guy Vladimir Tabak, and the so-called Ano Dialog, which is like a gongo, a government organized non-governmental organization, so a fake NGO, basically to take care of domestic propaganda to a large extent, or at least took over, from the Prigozhin assets. And the core approach is to co-opt all social groups by providing highly fragmented niche messages to them, including those who do not like the Kremlin or Putin. So this relies on controlled influencers among different groups, but even in opposition, controlled leaks, alleged leaks from the Kremlin, and of course the use of trolls, troll farms, shields, and bots, or sock puppets, fake social profiles. Propaganda should be fun. Unlike the Soviet propaganda, which was quite dull most of the time, the new style of Russian propaganda tries to make it more entertaining, more interesting, more fun, to try to make it more effective. And when it comes to foreign propaganda, the main focus is, of course, to fan all possible conflicts and discord, all conflicts that already are out there, just trying to enhance them. One interesting case is this guy called Yegor Putilov, who was active in Sweden and who was basically caught. He pretended to be a member of the Russian opposition. He actually received asylum in Sweden, and he was employed by the Swedish authorities as a bureaucrat in the migration office and in the Swedish parliament eventually. And he published articles, newspaper articles, highly opinionated op-eds and columns under different pseudonyms. Some of them were, for example, pro-migration, pro-immigration, and others were anti-immigration, right? So why would someone do that, right? Of course, obviously, to kind of create this fake, fierce debate, and enhance the possible potential conflict or crack that already is in the society. We can also look briefly at these examples of Facebook ads that were funded by Russian companies linked to Prigozhin during the 2016 US presidential election. Already a classical selection. And you can see that there are both extremely conservative and anti-migrant, anti-minority messages, and also extremely pro-minority messages, right? Why did they fund these ads, right? Once again, to polarize the societies even more, right? I will probably, since I need probably to speed up now, I will just briefly say a few words here about how the Russian approach today is also based on trying to infiltrate the much more open Western media system, and than during the Cold War, much more open than during the Cold War. Also imitating a lot of the Western approaches and the use of Russian institutions and cultural initiatives abroad, especially those working with the diaspora, of course, in famous organizations such as Россотрудничество, and so on. A case that I have been studying empirically is the operation, a case of modern Russian information influence, which is called Operation Secondary Infection. We don't know how it was called by the practitioners behind it, but it was the name that was given to it by the people, the security teams at Facebook and Twitter who discovered it, Twitter before Elon Musk, in reference to this old Operation Infection that I just told you about. So it was a concerted campaign that is still partly running, but it was largely confined to 2014, 2020. It used hundreds of accounts, mostly one-time use, single-use burner accounts that spread thousands, over about 2,500 of verified items, articles, blogs, videos, social media posts in a number of languages, including, for example, German and Swedish, but also Ukrainian and Russian. And they used a lot of alternative media and self-publishing websites, such as Indymedia or Medium.com, and tried to use a lot of forgeries and fakes. So, for example, forged governmental leaks or blog posts, and completely made up stories, such as the Swedish politician and former Prime Minister Carl Bildt allegedly becoming the next Prime Minister of Ukraine. And some of these stories were later republished by Russia Today in Spain, right? And here you can see an example. This is a fake entry in a doctored entry in Carl Bildt's blog, where it's in Swedish, also not quite correct, not completely correct Swedish grammatically, and it's basically about his lashing out. It's not him, right? It's fake, but the author is lashing out against the election interference in Sweden. But they forgot to change the title, the heading, which says the new drama in the Syrian tragedy. I mean, I think you can understand that, right? So, which shows that they could be quite negligent very often. This is an example of basically the list of some of the associated items in the Nordic sub-campaign, particularly aimed at mainly Sweden. And they deal with a lot of issues, mainly trying to, discredit Ukraine, but also strengthen, enhance all sorts of divisions within Sweden. So what do we see in this campaign when we compare it to the Soviet model? We can maybe still find some traces of Marxist-Leninism, like in the form of anti-elitism, the kind of critique from below, we can say. But the really zero-sum game perspective dominates now fully. They have good knowledge of local realities, which probably come as tip-offs from local agents and embassy staff. And they rely heavily on forgeries, at least in this campaign. They use a lot of source laundering, creating these long ranges of references to different sources that kind of hide the origins of information. And then, once again, I would like to emphasize this. They not only were republished by RT and Sputnik in Sweden, but also made it to reputed newspapers in Sweden, such as Dagens Nyheter, which is like the main liberal newspaper in Sweden. And here you can see of the overlap between the Russia Today, Sputnik, and the secondary Infektion material. Not everything was republished, and of course we didn't have access to absolutely every single item, I think. So this is just what we found, but there is still quite a significant overlap between the three. And if we look more closely at how fakes were produced, we can see, for example, this case of how Ukraine's alleged meddling in the Swedish elections was constructed. So at first they published a series of articles saying that the rather right-wing populist party, Sweden Democrats, was obtaining help from Russian hackers, among others, to win the election through fraud. Then they were followed by a new series of articles describing hacking attacks by the Sweden Democrats against the other political parties. And then they did a U-turn and released a new, bigger series of articles that allegedly distributed a staged leak, a memo, which was completely forged from the office of the Ukrainian Prime Minister at the time, Volodymyr Groysman, which detailed a plan to help our allies, the Social Democratic Party, so the enemy of the Sweden Democrats, by launching an online disinformation campaign against Sweden Democrats in Russia. Right. So this is how they planted first this fake evidence for Ukrainian intervention, and then they sort of exposed it in a fake way. So now coming to a conclusion, we can definitely see some contextual continuities, and we can see that they're still, just like in the Soviet times, they take advantage of existing conflicts and vulnerabilities. Some scholars believe that the current Russian output in forgeries is actually much greater than in the Soviet times. The continuity with the rhetoric is similar. The obsession with infections and biolabs is particular, the fascism narrative, and so on. There is even some continuity of individuals. So, for example, Putin's deputy chief of staff, Alexei Gromov, the one who is credited with basically running the system of centralized system of media censorship in Russia, and also holding these infamous Thursday meetings where the Kremlin is dictating the line to the editors of newspapers and other media outlets. He started out as a diplomat, probably specialized in political intelligence in the 80s. Valentin Zorin was a really prominent Soviet mouthpiece on foreign policy, and while he was still alive, he died in 2016. He actively participated in developing Russian takes and a Russian stance on Ukraine. And even in some cases, the foreign agents of influence were inherited. What is different is that there is a dissimilarity as regards the target groups. So while the Soviet propaganda prioritized decision makers and high-profile experts, researchers, and journalists, the material that we are seeing now seems to target fringe ideologies and conspiracy theories. However, this might be, and quite plausibly, is just the artifact of the material that we have access to. And decision makers and experts were targeted through different campaigns and channels. We can also take note of the generous budget and the industrial scale, like pumping out disinformation regularly, consistently, and systematically throughout several years in several languages. And it's interesting that almost none of it went viral for real. And but why it was like this, we can only speculate. But maybe the main purpose was to create a laundering network for open channel media like Russia Today and Sputnik, and occasionally Western mainstream media. So in that sense, it was really effective. Then we can also see that while it had this industrial scale, the secondary Infektion campaign was quite notable for its poor quality of the forgeries and the overall approach to work. We could say that they were more like spammers trying to bombard the web with the new forgeries on a really massive scale, but forgeries of quite poor quality with lots of linguistic mistakes and also bad photoshopping that can be really, really demonstrated very easily. So how can we explain this? It stands in a really strong, stark contrast to the Soviet approach, which emphasized in those KGB handbooks and manuals that it is highly important to do forgeries at high level. High quality artifacts are important, crucial to success in propaganda and information influence. So we believe that this might be because the current media landscape, the mediatization, which requires permanent, constant updates, and which kind of weakened the gatekeeping held by experts and journalists and editors and intellectuals in the mass communication societies of the 20th century, basically make it more reasonable for propagandists to put out as much fake information as possible, hoping that maybe one thing will take off. And some further conclusions include an interesting formulation that I found in the KGB manuals, which is продвижение информации, literally advancing the information to someone. It's used with a dative case, right? To whom can be translated as propagating information to whom, or promoting, or maybe feeding the information to the enemy. So I think it is really important to understanding the media logic behind the KGB information influence. And then these concepts suggest a practice where certain information, such as facts, allegation, interpretation, or narrative, is continuously fed to the target until it is fully advanced to its perception and accepted, possibly as one's own, which really reminds of this technique of planted inference that I talked about earlier. And also it shows that propaganda may be something different than we typically think. So, for example, they may want to just create evidence, fake evidence for someone else's nefarious activity. The excessive focus on disinformation that we have, I believe, right now, obscures the fact that any information has been traditionally weaponized by the KGB and its successors. So it's not just about fake news and disinformation. It's also about using partial and using even completely truthful information to attain a specific destructive and subversive political goal. And my final conclusion here today is that our simplistic approaches sometimes do not account for the fact that a good share of communication may be a spectacle, which renews the urgency of the reflexive control model. So with that, I will stop, and thank you so very much for this.
Well, thank you very much for this insightful and interesting and illustrative talk. I have lots of questions myself, actually, but of course, the audience should also get like the lion's share of the time to address their questions to you. So please feel free to post your questions in the Q&A thing, like there are already some. I'll just, however, start with one thing that may be actually interesting, especially for our students who like also look at, methods of work, not only like, the results of work, but actually how did you how you do research. Maybe you could say a few words about that. I mean, I saw the KGB manuals, which is a very interesting historical source, of course. So my question would be like how they are available, how they were made available to you. How were you able to work with them? And also when it comes to this sort of like internet research, big data research, maybe you could say a few words about this.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you so much. This is a really, really important and crucial question. So first of all, I have to say that, I mean, it's not easy to access the KGB material, but it's not impossible. I mean, some of it was even posted and published online. So in principle, if you look really, really well, if you really want to find them, you will find some of these handbooks online now. But primarily, we have to thank the openness and the policy of the former KGB archives in countries like Ukraine. So Ukraine, I think, has been exemplary. Not always, not only Ukraine, of course. We can also think about the Baltic countries. We can think about some post-communist countries such as Poland or Czech Republic that were quite open about the former secret services and intelligence services archives. But Ukraine particularly was really open and the complete opposite of Russia in terms of this. Whereas Russia kind of made access to the former KGB archives more difficult to researchers and practically impossible. Ukraine practiced an enormous amount of openness. And this is really a blessing because I think the Ukrainian KGB archives, since Ukraine was such a well integrated part of the Soviet Union, they hold perhaps more interesting material than the former archives in some post-communist countries, or a different type of material. The one that maybe more was shared with Moscow. So in Kiev, we are more likely to find the same type of materials that were used in Moscow as well. Even though a lot was burned in 1991. So in August 1991, there was a lot of smoke in central Kiev because they were burning lots of documents. But they couldn't burn everything, of course. And probably these manuals were not their main focus, right? So they can be accessed. So we have the like case numbers and files for them, and we're still digging up stuff. So this is really a gold mine in a way. Of course, it's also quite a specific experience to work in a former KGB archive, which is now the archive of the State Security Service of Ukraine. And it's very open, but I think you need to rely on a lot of help from the librarians or archivists. And they really know their collections well. So in terms of this, I think it's also like as often in Eastern Europe, I think it's important to cultivate a relationship with the archivist. I think that helps a lot. And this is one aspect. As for the big data and the digital part, I mean, a lot of data raw data has been captured by fact checkers and different groups that work on a more practical level. So, for example, in this analysis of the secondary infection, I relied mainly on the material collected by digital forensics lab, Graphica. And they have quite a comprehensive catalog of the items in the campaign. So it's very convenient to work with it. But I mean, obviously, this is not the only way to do it. I mean, this is just one particular case, and there are more cases to study. So it's also tricky because, as I said, there is probably too much material in terms of the digital sphere. And it is important to know what you are looking for and to know how to navigate it. So I think, the technical details, such as, the software or the archives where you can find the material, the primary sources, is actually secondary, but you need to be guided by a vision and an understanding of what you're looking for. So, and in terms of this, departing from the Soviet model was really a blessing that simplified a lot of tasks because you know what you are looking for immediately, right? You are looking for the parallels or differences with the Soviet model. So as long as you have this theoretical principle, I think it becomes much easier to sift through this massive amount of data.
Thank you very much. I will pick some questions from the audience. There is one question wondering about the role, if any, of independent Russian journalists and media in countering these information operations and how their work being affected by these campaigns. And I would actually add my own question to it. I mean, the phenomenon of like a political, multi-factioned Russian political immigration. I mean, it's of course it's older than the full-scale invasion, but actually, I think it's after the full-scale invasion that we begin to see something that kind of resembles the situation of 1920s Russian exile, and also like the intra-factional struggles of the Russian exile in the 1920s. They actually, I have a sort of deja vu as someone who studied the 1920s, looking at the intra-factional struggles that are going on right now. And I mean, about the campaigns of the 1920s, we know at least about some of the occurrences very well, that they were orchestrated, like like different factions of the Russian immigration were pitched against each other by Soviet Secret Service agents. So would you see a new quality in Russian foreign propaganda, like after the full-scale invasion, in targeting particularly the Russian political opposition abroad?
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much. This is a very rich question. Definitely a subject for another talk or a lecture, maybe a monograph even. I can't say like on the question from the public. I can't say I started this directly. You know, the involvement of independent Russian journalists in documenting or maybe uncovering, you know, the Russian propaganda machinery. But I think there is definitely some good work being done. So we definitely saw, for example, I remember just once again, this was not the focus of the study. So I'm just being completely unsystematic here, but I remember some really good articles exposing the situation at the Institute of Journalism at the Moscow State University, and the persecutions of the faculty that were oppositional to the Kremlin, and also persecution of the students, you know, and the complete kind of system of censorship that Yelena Vartanova personally supervised and instilled, you know, in this and installed in this faculty. So that was published by Russian journalists based on the leaks, of course, from the faculty, from the students. So this is just one example that came immediately to my mind. Maybe not the best example, but I definitely saw much more of such examples. So yes, definitely there is good work being done. But on the other hand, the problem with the Russian approach to this is that sometimes it's very difficult to distinguish between a genuine leak and a forged leak, right? So very often we're left guessing as to like what is going on. So, for example, I remember an example that might be seemingly unrelated to this, but I remember maybe over a year ago there was this leak allegedly from Putin's close circle saying that he was heavily influenced by COVID and by the COVID restrictions when he was taking decision to invade Ukraine. And now that I thought quite a lot about it, you know, and honestly, while I'm seeing some kind of merits in that line of thinking, at the same time, we cannot be certain that this is not an attempt to plant this idea, you know, that Putin just went insane. He's just nuts, you know, he's a maniac, and he can do anything, you know, he can, you know, nuke the US, or he can nuke Paris or London, or I don't know, Bern maybe, or Zurich, right? Let alone Stockholm or Warsaw. So I don't know. It's very hard to do that, you know. And I think it's basically it's safe to assume, you know, that most of these leaks are actually some attempt at influence or manipulation. But of course, we do not know. So this is a huge complication. And speaking about the factionalism, I mean, it also reminds me of the 19th century, and you know, the Russian political emigres in the 19th century, in the early 20th century. It was very similar. I mean, let's think about Hudson and let's think about how anarchists and Bolsheviks also were both influencing the situation and also influenced, in a later generation. So and this is definitely something that is used by the Kremlin. And that I think some of this factionalism is probably artificially created. Once again, it's impossible to say. So we are really deep in the speculation territory now. But I think it would be reasonable to assume that a lot of this factionalism is artificially manufactured by the Kremlin, just by the same means that were described by Joseph Conrad in his novel, creating these sometimes fake oppositional organizations or planting their agents within genuine oppositional circles and so on. And I think it is definitely it's very hard and punishing to be a Russian opposition figure these days because above all, you cannot really trust anyone. Probably, you do not really know who's genuine and who's not. But you still need to do something, and you need to work with the people around you. So I think that was the issue definitely throughout the 20th century. That was the issue throughout the 19th century, as soon as Akhrana was founded and formed. So I think we can once again talk about these parallels, not just with the Soviet situation or the Soviet models of political control or influence, but also the Tsarist ones. This is the really longue durée we're talking about, I guess. And it might even look like some kind of pattern that is being maybe repeated all over. I don't know, maybe subconsciously or consciously. This is once again like speculation, so it's probably worth a separate investigation. But I will probably stop here.
Thank you. I'll pick two questions that both relate to your statement on the low quality of the forgery. So one listener wonders, so that Russia is now focusing less on the high quality of forgeries and seems to have understood the use of an overflow of information. Did they realize this from the start, or was there a period of high quality fake online posts? Goes one question. The other question wonders whether you think of the spam of cheap propaganda pieces, such as the Operation Secondary Infection, as a kind of deception of more sophisticated propaganda pieces. So basically a kind of a propaganda of propaganda, if you will. So the question goes. And I would attach a tiny question to it because I think it's related to that. Do we know anything about the rank and file workers of Russian information? Like you mentioned some high-ranking figures, even like with some continuities from Soviet times. But do we know actually anything about like the countess, like click workers basically, and like, Photoshop workers and so on? Who does this actually? Like,
excellent questions, all three. Thank you so much. On the first one, wow, it's really it sounds like a research question already, and to be able to answer that, we would need to do some kind of longitudinal study, perhaps, and find material and cases that would be comparable. I think that this is something that perhaps was introduced by the rise of internet marketing, perhaps in the 2000s and 2010s. And there were also some really interesting figures active in the development of the Russian basically online let's say online media and social media and also services such as even internet shops and so on, who are engaged by the Kremlin, who are actively, basically, they have been coveted and recruited and used. So there is a lot of this marketing influence in this new model, which is also a difference from the Soviet one. They are more like a seller. They act perhaps a little bit more like sellers than or vendors than like ideologists or something. So I guess that happened when internet in Russia became pervasive, and I would say perhaps around late 2000s to early 2010s. But that's speculation once again. You would need a separate project to study that. Propaganda for propaganda. I mean, as a cover for more sophisticated influence. I mean, definitely yes. I think that's really plausible. It will be hard to answer this empirically, but I think just thinking about it rationally and analytically, uh, this would be a very smart way to do it. If you have, for example, some very high placed agents of influence in, for example, in Western media or Western academia, who are spreading, Russian takes or Russian messages or narratives in top quality, like high-fi propaganda. Then definitely you might use these like low quality, massive spamming campaigns as sort of distraction or cover. So, or maybe you are targeting just different groups, different niches at different levels. So it's difficult once again to say definitely what of the two, for example, it is without studying it empirically. But I guess, yeah, definitely there should be a link between the high level, high profile influence and the low profile influence. And as to your question on the rank and file or click and file personnel, yes, and we know so surprisingly a lot about them, particularly thanks to wonderful research by a Russian scholar in Germany, Serge Polakov, who is doing fantastic work on studying the Internet Research Agency, a former asset belonging to Yevgeny Prigozhin. And he even interviewed some of the former trolls, and they seem to come from this kind of diverse background of, I would say, internet proletariat. So people who do low paid work online, but also maybe we can also talk about them as some kind of, media or communication proletariat. So there are these like figures like media aristocracy, who are very well known and omnipresent, like Solovyov or Simonyan, high profile propagandists. And then there are these like rank and file people who, for example, started. They're typically young people in their 30s, 20s, who started at the departments of journalism, or they maybe started public relations, or they started perhaps marketing, or maybe they started something completely different, but they ended up in, for example, internet marketing business. And then they were just hired. They actually, like the Internet Research Agency, would post their vacancies on just openly on job websites in Russia and recruit like any other like a marketing firm or a PR agency, So in terms of this, they're not so different from any other communicators working in PR agencies. And once again, there were different people like the sort that were more like people who work for the Mechanical Turk, who just like use, I don't know, like 10 laptops and 20 phones to post like hundreds of comments every hour. And then there are people who are also higher in the hierarchy, like coordinating or, doing some high profile work while still remaining part of this kind of communicariat, like communicative proletariat or something like that. Yeah. So yeah, we do know something about them.
Thank you. Okay, we have quite little time left, and there are still so many questions. So I will try to
I'll try to be very brief.
summarize them as much as I can, and of course, like quick answers would be very appreciated. So one could say there's a whole group of questions about the content of propaganda, especially concerning domestic Russian propaganda. So one listener asks about the prevalence of Soviet, particularly war-themed films on Russian television. And whether this is a particular strategy or merely a coincidence. Another listener asks about the role of collective memories. Like, what role do collective memories play in Russian propaganda? A third question addresses the sort of like new pro-war popular music, like Shaman.
Mhm.
And this brings me to a bit more overarching question, because as far as I see, we do not see much of this in foreign propaganda, actually, in Russian foreign propaganda. So it's not like Shaman is promoted worldwide. It's not like Russia today
Thankfully.
is writing about World War II all the time. So what would you say, like how like the division between foreign Russian foreign propaganda and Russian domestic propaganda, how much of a division is there, and how much of a division of labor probably is there as well?
Of course, there is quite a lot of division, and it is only logical from the perspective of any practitioner, because you need to orient yourself towards the audience you are trying to influence. You need to adapt, and you need to tailor your messages and your rhetorics as to the audience. So, of course, domestic, there is a lot of mass culture that is being used and instrumentalized and weaponized as a means of propaganda. Yes, the films, absolutely. They're all, and by the way, they're all commercial failures. They're all funded by the government. And it's just such a straightforward case, actually, of propaganda. Thanks for mentioning this. Historical memories, absolutely, and it starts from school. So we can also talk about how education is controlled and used to spread a particular version of history. And Jade McGlynn, in her Memory Makers, raised this point and started it brilliantly. I can also point out to my old article published in 2015 titled Little Patriotic War, about the first limited invasion in Donbass and the annexation of Crimea, where I see like this kind of resurgence of the Second World War narratives, the Great Patriotic War. Yes, we have figures like Shaman and so on. So this brings me to one interesting figure in the study of propaganda, Jacques Ellul, a French thinker and sociologist, who is not maybe really well adapted to empirical study of propaganda, but I really like his overall theoretical approach. And for him, propaganda is basically almost like the entire way of life that is shaped by dictatorial government in a particular way. And in this way, it's really multi-level. It's like a universe of interconnected stories that are told through a variety of forms and genres and through all possible channels, starting from primary school, and way into mass culture and news media. So you are surrounded by this. And once you are surrounded by this narrative universe, there is no way you can leave it, unless you leave Russia. That's how it works domestically. And for the foreign audience, they, as in the Soviet times, they need to use a lot of manipulation and adaptation, just like they needed to adapt to Islamists and use like some kind of pro-Islamic rhetoric in contradiction to what they were doing domestically and saying domestically, or how they used and co-opted nationalism in post-colonial context. Just in the same way that also trying to sell different messages, let's say, anti-LGBT rhetorics to people, to homophobic people, and then sell some kind of anti-elitist messages to some very progressive people, and then sell anti-immigration messages to some far-right people, and so on. So they are really smart at targeting and tailoring.
Thank you. I'll try to summarize another batch of questions, because of course, if we are not dealing with like a merely historical subject, but about something that's really relevant for nowadays politics. So obviously, there are a lot of questions about like what to do. Yeah, about что делать, like about the applicability of like how do we use these results. So there's one long question that I cannot read it because it's very long, but basically the baseline is how much do historical analogies help us to understand uh, Russian propaganda at all? I mean, that's a valid question, of course. And there are like even two, like one could say, parallel questions. One of them asks like how to, as the question goes, deliver truth to the people inside Russia. Another question straight afterwards wonders whether you can outline some ways of countering Kremlin information for the Ukrainian audience. And another question wonders what you think about Switzerland's decision not to prohibit Sputnik and Russia today, unlike the European Union did. So, like, this batch of questions relating to the actuality of your findings, basically.
Yeah, okay, I'll try to be very brief. So I'll start with the last one. I don't think I'm in a position, as someone new in Switzerland to kind of dictate, what Switzerland should do. But looking from the side, not banning Russia Today and Sputnik was a silly thing to do. And of course, deplatforming is the primary tool of basically shutting down foreign propaganda and information influence attempts. And we can see how successful it was in the case of Ukraine, which banned Russian social media in 2017. And as a result, was much less vulnerable to Russian propaganda in 2022. Then countering this for the Ukrainian audiences, that would require an entire lecture. And I mean, we are writing a book on this, so this will be covered there, I think. But I would say you need to be proactive. Some basics like you need to be proactive, not reactive. You need to actually put out your own narrative first rather than react to the enemy narrative. And you also need to be inventive and use perhaps non-standard techniques such as storytelling, humor, mocking, and other things that kind of asymmetrical responses. You need to be asymmetrical, not symmetrical or reactive, but be proactive and asymmetrical to deal with this. How to deliver the truth to Russians in Russia? It's, I think, the same way we could deliver truth to the citizens of the Third Reich in 1942. So I don't think there is any real way. So, I mean, they have already access to all the information, right? You can access, in principle, Ukrainian Telegram channels in Russia. You can access all possible kind of websites and platforms through VPN. It's just that you choose not to, right? Because you have been raised in this narrative universe, which is comfortable for you. So why would you be living it, right? And the only way to do it is just basically to dismantle this machinery, to dismantle the infrastructure. But that would entail, regime change in Russia in the first place. And how are the historical analogies helpful? I mean, they are. I ask that question myself quite often. I mean, history. I don't know. Is history the teacher of life, or is history a teacher whose lessons are never learned? I think that maybe we are really bad at learning the lessons, but we can. It doesn't mean that we have to stop teaching. And if we hear, Western intelligence services saying now in 2024 that they're surprised by the extent of the Chinese influence in the West, then I guess something is really deeply wrong with our understanding at this level, at the level of organizations, institutions in the West that were created, established to defend the societies. If they are failing, then something is deeply wrong. And how to fix it? I think we need to maybe look back and at some similar, not identical, but similar situations, and at the analogies, and try to see how things worked back then and how they were dealt with and what worked and what not, and then maybe some kind of adaptation to the present day realities would help.
All right, thank you so much. Unfortunately, we have to close the questions now. I'm very sorry for those whose questions were not answered, probably. So thanks a lot, Roman Horbyk, for this presentation. And before you leave, just one short announcement, which I will make in German, as it concerns a German event. Also morgen gibt es gewissermaßen eine außerplanmäßige Veranstaltung zu dieser Veranstaltungsreihe, und zwar eben nicht per Zoom, sondern live. Es gibt morgen in der kleinen Aula der UZH um 18:15 Uhr eine Podiumsdiskussion zum Thema der Schweiz als Schauplatz und Zielscheibe russischer Propaganda. Es werden diskutieren Alexandra Urman von der UZH, Marko Kovic von der Hochschule Luzern und Anna Jecharjova von der Wochenzeitung WOZ. Und alle sind sehr herzlich willkommen. Ich versuche ebenfalls da zu sein. Genau. So, thank you very much for your talk and see you tomorrow or next week.
Yes, thank you so much for having me. Vielen Dank und einen schönen Abend an alle.